Okay, so at Stanford we have something that's called the George Shultz rule. The George Shultz rule says that the length of the introduction is inversely proportional to the importance of the person. That's when George Shultz is speaking, you just say, "Welcome, Secretary Shultz." It's the end of the introduction, and I'm going to introduce Irv and Jim that way because they hardly need an introduction. But just briefly, Irv Grousbeck. Actually, before we do that, how many of you have took a class with either Irv or Jim?
Wow.
Okay, actually, I don't even need to make an introduction. So I'll just say, just start by saying, obviously you all know Irv and Jim and have had the experience of learning from them, as many, many students have at the school. Irv, among other things, was the founder of the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies, and he basically put the business school, along with other faculty members at the time, on a path to its current position in entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial leadership, which is just a remarkable position to be in. And Jim, who was himself an entrepreneur, has come back to the school, is teaching, doing amazing things for us in the classroom, and also in leadership and working with a lot of our lecturers and our young faculty to help them develop as teachers, and has played a very, very important role in the school and is really the pulse of the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies today at the school. So it's a great pleasure to have this discussion with you. Okay, so how we're going to do this, I'm going to give them a few questions, and then we'll just open it up and take questions from the audience. And let me start maybe just by giving the two of you a little bit of a chance to talk about the state of entrepreneurship at the GSB and how you see it.
Entrepreneurship is alive and well at the GSB, kind of keeping with the early roots of the CES. The mission still continues to be education and not incubation. I think our broad view is that it's worth understanding and examining entrepreneurship regardless of your intended career path post the GSB. To the well-represented class of 2018, just to share some statistics, 100% of the graduating class from 18 took an elective in entrepreneurship. That was spread out across 85 sections of 65 course numbers, taught by over 100 faculty members, about 70% of which are lecturers, 30% tenure-line faculty members. There are some core courses across that make up the foundation, I think, of our entrepreneurial curriculum. The largest one being Formation of New Ventures. We get about 320 students. To your point on collaboration, 100% of those sections are co-taught with tenure-line faculty members and practitioners. Managing Growing Enterprises comes in next at about 315. And then rounding out that core is Startup Garage, which has about 230 students from the class of 2018. That said, while those classes are extremely popular and well subscribed, the curriculum's changing. I'll just give two examples. Steve Callender, along with a practitioner, added a course in innovation in energy. And Stefano Zinios, who's the co-director for the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies, along with two other lecturers, took the Startup Garage pedagogy and applied it to the search fund process. And this year we'll have our first official sections of Startup Garage. Kind of beyond the campus, we just completed, thanks to Deb Whitman, who's the head of the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies, just committed a completed survey of our alums. So dating back to 1997, 28% of GSB alums have started their own company. 43% of those have done it more than once. And if you look to the illustrious class of 2018, 16% said they were going to pursue their own venture post-graduation. Kind of compared to what we would think of as our peer schools, that average is somewhere between 2% and 8%. So it's a substantially overrepresented career path here at the GSB. And an additional 19 or 20% of students join a startup post, making it over a third of the class that's involved in the startup ecosystem right out of the GSB.
Anything you want to add to that, Irv?
No, we don't have time.
We don't have time. Well, let me turn to question two then. So Irv, maybe you tell us a little bit about how the teaching of entrepreneurship has evolved. And actually, maybe one thing you could also just share with everyone, which, because I love hearing about it, is the way your teaching has evolved over time.
Okay. Well, first, I'd like to add Jim's and my welcome to that of John's. It's just truly remarkable and wonderful to see so many of you back for your reunions, and for me to see so many familiar faces. It means a lot to the school for you to come back and show that commitment. We want to be sure that we return it to you and trust that you will have both a stimulating and a very fun weekend. So thank you for coming. I also want to say, on a whimsical note, that the three of us better be on our game because we're the only thing standing between you and cocktail hour. So entrepreneurship was in the shadows 25 years ago at well-thought-of universities, and the shadows is exactly where it belonged. It was often taught idiosyncratically by some man, white male, rushing from his office with a sheaf of papers into class and saying, "Here's a business plan I got a few days ago, let's analyze it." It became so siloed and so dependent on his experience that it was disgraceful. And I was part of that. I saw that. I tried to do better. But I understand that the teaching of entrepreneurship 25 and more years ago was properly placed when tenured faculty would look over there and say, "Who's that fellow with a tie rushing in here to teach some class? Who is that anyway? And what are they teaching? Entrepreneurship? Isn't that about crazy, egotistical, braggadocio, bombastic people who love risk? And really, what's he doing here?" So recognizing that we're at a research university, people among us with support from the dean's office started to change that. And we started to do extensive case writing and some more dignified research than that, but that entrepreneurship really lends itself to case writing, and to develop something that was other than experience-based. They say all advice is autobiographical, and that's disgraceful. It ought to be thoughtful, and it ought to work from a broader base. And so that's really what we tried to do. One of the brilliant breakthroughs is properly attributable to Professor Chuck Holloway, now emeritus, who said, "We're going to have a terrible time recruiting tenure-line faculty to entrepreneurship. Let's recruit our faculty to entrepreneurship." And as Jim mentioned a minute ago, that was the genesis here of co-taught cases. And there were 3 winners from that. There was each the faculty member, the lecturer, and mostly the students, benefiting from different points of view and making the teaching more structured and the pedagogy more sound. That really was a significant breakthrough. We also took as our mantra, if you will, that we wanted to demystify entrepreneurship for our students, help them understand what was behind the curtain, and to rationalize the activities, picking the best entrepreneurs, the most thoughtful entrepreneurs who don't love risk, they abhor risk, and who aren't generally egotistical, they're for the team, and other best practices within the arena. That idea of demystifying rather than proselytizing was a significant shift in view. And when we started to do that, thinking that the students know a lot about consulting, they know a lot about financial services, they know about government service, they know about corporate life, let's help them understand what the issues they would confront as entrepreneurs are, the better to make a career decision. They say that education is what's left after you've forgotten everything you ever knew. And that's where modeling in the classroom came into effect. Teachers realized that how can they teach leadership if they're treating the students harshly? And I must say, 15 or 20 years ago, I hate late students, as many of you know who raised your hand. I think that's unprofessional, and it's annoying. So I might have maybe once or twice succumbed to the temptation to call out a student in front of his or her peers, but I quickly realized, how can I be teaching leadership and entrepreneurial management and embarrassing a student in front of his or her peers? That doesn't make sense. So I still don't like late students. I don't say anything when they come in late. I send them an email. So one of the things I remember from years ago's undergraduate education is the way a few of my teachers walked and talked and thought and analyzed situations. And I think that residue is powerful. So we're very sensitive to our comportment in the classroom and have become much more teacher-centric. I'll stop there.
Well, let me follow up on that.
Excuse me, student-centric, my mistake, I misspoke. I'm looking at him and that influenced what I said.
We probably do have some teachers who are teacher-centric, though, so it does sometimes happen. Let me pick up on something you said, because you talked about the way you learned teaching, and I think one of the things that for me is really a very special and feature of the CES is the way in which we've taught teaching to people who come in. And I'd love to hear actually both of you talk a little bit, how is it that you develop a great teacher? What's the process, and how do you do that intentionally? I know, Jim, we've been talking a lot about, but Irv, you've had a long track record of doing it. So what are the ingredients? How do you develop someone to be a really terrific classroom teacher?
So I think a certain amount of it is attributable, as it would be in any hiring scenario, to a careful look at the person who is about to become a teacher, to be sure that she or he is coming for the right reasons. Chuck Holloway, when we were building up the lecturer faculty under the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies, and I were asking ourselves, why does this person want to come and teach at Stanford Business School? Is it to enhance his or her resume so that the consulting business improves? Is it for egotistical reasons? Or is it to serve the students, be collegial, and do some effective research? We missed on occasion, but I think the screen was an important first step. And then when we decided to have them join us and they agreed, we would suggest that they visit the great teachers. It didn't matter what they taught. We'd send them to Professor Van Horn's class in finance. And we'd send them to a number of people who were kind enough to say, sure, have them sit in. And so they would view different styles of teaching so that they didn't run the risk of copying Jim or somebody else who was already an accomplished teacher, but to find their own voice, be encouraged to look more at general effectiveness and translate it into their own style rather than mimic somebody. And then we would be very careful to go to their classes with their blessing after they got their sea legs and sit quietly in the back and give them some feedback from time to time. So that interactive process of their listening to great teachers or observing great teachers and then being observed by some of us and giving them feedback was a process that continued over the first several years of their experience here.
Yeah, and I think we're trying to take that foundation that was built by Irv, Chuck, and the rest of the team to kind of formalize that. We're looking today, I'm part of the committee that's looking at teaching across the GSB. We're adding mentorship programs, formalized structured training, taking a lot of those things that Irv was talking about that are available when you visit the classroom, making them available online, kind of ad hoc after a faculty member has a challenging situation in a classroom, having the resources to talk to, having somebody to visit their classes and comment on. So we're trying to build much more of an accessible base to new faculty.
We've got everyone here is back after some years, and some of them are entrepreneurs, and some of them, are doing all different things. I'd love to get you, the two of you, to share a little bit you do a lot of mentoring for students who come back, some of the advice you typically give to students who come back and see you after a few years. What are the types of things you see, and what is the advice you end up giving to them?
The more advice I try to give, the less I talk and the more questions I ask. I've been wrong so often about the likelihood of success of a venture that a student teed up for me that I've stopped saying that's a bad idea. I'm not sure I ever said it quite that harshly, but trying to be discouraging. We simply talk about, assuming that a student is coming in with an idea, which is a narrow subset of your question, I try to ask questions about and be sure that it's market-driven, not resource-driven, and that they have reasonable running room if they're successful, to talk about some of the elements that we talk about in class, such as putting A players in key seats, being sure that funding is not a limitation, and just some fundamental things that all of you know, and I'm sure actually that those of you who've been out 5, 10, and 15 years, and perhaps those of you who have been out 1 year, have already been approached on occasion to be a counselor, and have found that the less you say and the more you ask, and the more you let the person talk about his or her dreams and needs and approaches, the more effective the so-called advice is.
I think we also try to, both in the classroom and to students and alums that I talk to, focus on the topic of alignment, making sure that you've got a clear understanding of your objectives with your partner, whether that's business or life, that you've thought about lifestyle considerations, you've talked about time horizons to liquidity, that you've thought about how long you can go without cash flow, what your view is in terms of a need for ownership or control, and make sure that both the business you choose as well as your human and financial capital have aligned along the same set of objectives. I've seen some folks who are looking at starting a business. I was talking with one just recently who was talking about starting a company for intergenerational transfer, and then took money from a venture capital firm, which there endeth the story. And you've kind of set yourself up for an eventual conflict, an inevitable conflict. So thinking about aligning your resources with your business and your goals.
Let me give everyone in the audience an opportunity to ask a couple of questions.
Thank you for taking the time to share your insights. This question is for Dr. Grousbeck. I actually sat in on your lunch session around this time last year as an almost grad. I remember you sharing a story about someone who came back in their mid-40s or something and shared their success with you, talked about how much money they're making, et cetera, and then ended the story with, "and I'm miserable." And I remember it stuck with me that you conveyed to us that was something you wanted us to be able to think about intentionally as we proceed forward. So I'm wondering, as you look at paths that GSB grads take, what are the flag posts along the way that are inflection points that drive decisions to keep people on the path towards their vision versus defaulting into areas that lead to that path you had shared?
Well, I think that this is anecdotal now. I have no data to support what I'm about to say, but I believe that there is a correlation between how people follow paths toward goals and the degree to which they're successful in attaining their own objectives. I think if one follows the shiny object approach, which job I've got here's another job, which one is better, this one or that one, and here's another one that's better than one I have, I think I'll go over there, as opposed to where am I trying to go? And I understand it's daunting to think in a 10 or 15 year time frame, but to the degree that you can start to do that and then find a way to self-mark along the way and ask, am I making progress toward where I want to go? And the kind of progress I think of as most useful is skills building, not label collecting. Where you were doesn't matter to investors. what you can do does matter to investors. And so staying on that path or as close to it as possible and building your skills, and then finally recognizing that there's a sunset when your risk aversion gradually changes and you're much less likely to go out on your own. So generally, sooner is better than later. That should not be interpreted as rush out and start or buy a business now. That's not the idea. It's simply that you do have a lot more flexibility and optionality when you're 32 than when you're 47.
I wanted to ask you, as entrepreneurs, now a lot of us are entrepreneurs and operators 5 years after graduation and more. What are some of the methods that you had as entrepreneurs to kind of keep your learning, keep developing? Because when we're here in business school, we could study in your classes and learn from cases. But kind of when you're in it, you mostly learn from your own experience. What are some of the resources you guys used, and what would you recommend some of the operators and entrepreneurs to do?
Yeah, I can think of three, at least kind of relating personally. I think first and foremost was kind of having a group of mentors, whether they knew they were mentors or not. Some of them are physically close to me at this point in time. In being able to have those honest dialogues with folks, I think part of getting the most out of your mentor is kind of letting your guard down and being honest. I'm having trouble with this decision because I'm concerned about my ability to execute, or I'm risk averse, or whatever you think that topic is. So I think that was an invaluable source, I think, for Kevin and I, my partner, as we started out. I think number two, at least along the entrepreneurial journey, listening to your customers. I think it's almost impossible to over-index on learning from your customers. That let us, our business evolved in many, many ways, and 100% of that was driven by understanding the needs of the people we were serving. I think you oftentimes can end up in tunnel vision, kind of thinking about yourself and your own strategy, but constantly going back and saying, what can we do for our customers was key. And then lastly, but not least, is learning from your team members. I think we've tried to create, at least in our business, this desire to bring on highly talented people and not let the hierarchy of the organization dictate your ability to impact the decisions that we make and outcome. And I think there's a real challenge associated with that. You have to be incredibly disciplined about it. But I think if you bring on great athletes, high attribute people, and really take the time to make sure their voice is heard, that can be a really powerful thing.
So here's the question. So you mentioned that you have changed your teaching style through the years. And I was wondering, what have you seen in terms of the student changing through the years? And what has been the features that have changed the most? And how have you adapted your teaching methods and styles to become a better teacher of those new generations, if you will?
So several comments about changes in students over a period of time. Students today, to my eye, have more finely honed interpersonal skills than they did in the past. They care more about friendships. They are less likely to put their head down for 10 years and work like a dog and then look up in their late 30s and say, now what does the rest of my life look like? So they want it all. And I admire that. I think that's a good thing. They want some balance, but they want success at home, if you will, in their personal lives, and they want professional success. I think students are, another thing I see is that they seem to be more fully committed to, easier to engage in the classroom. Maybe we've become more adroit at threatening them subtly by cold calling, I'm not sure. But I don't think so. They seem, more of them seem here, that they're really here to learn and absorb, and they spend more, I get more student visits after hours than I did 15 years ago. and that could be a reflection on me, but I think it's more likely a reflection on student changes. They're trying to get their money's worth, if you will, want to put it in commercial terms. And they're really more engaged in the life of the school and in relationships with each other, as well as in the curriculum and with the faculty members. And finally, I think they're mindful of the fact that a sense of entitlement is not a good thing. I believe I sense a lower percentage of students who feel entitled to get something just because they're smart and well educated and perhaps well born, but not necessarily. They realize more that they're entitled to what they earn, and therefore they're more in tune with the real world and represent the school much more satisfactorily.
I think they've also become more discerning, for lack of a better word, consumers of education. I think we've seen the average experience level, but also the average amount of education that people have in finance and accounting kind of bringing to the table. And students are really, really busy today. I mean, there's just so many demands on time that didn't exist when I started teaching 16 years ago, or certainly not when I was a student. And I think that places the onus on us to kind of up our content delivery, both in richness and in kind of whether it's attractive and valuable to students. So I think it's made, in some ways, teaching easier, but in some ways it's made teaching harder, because we have to work a little bit harder than we did before.
As we're thinking about the future of work and how the nature of work itself is changing, the work experience has changed with remote work, globally distributed teams, and of course the rise of automation, artificial intelligence, how should entrepreneurial leaders be thinking about the way in which entrepreneurship itself is going to be changing and to prepare ourselves for that new future?
That's you.
That's me?
Yeah, that's you.
Oh. I was hoping it was one of you. So I think that it's changing in a way that favors entrepreneurs. My sense is that the workforce is more nimble. They're more willing to make changes. One of the trends at play underneath that is that corporate loyalty to a corporation is no longer being returned. The attraction of working for larger companies has diminished, and that's statistically. So if you have an attractive entrepreneurial venture, it's easier to recruit A players, quality people to your team than perhaps it was some years ago when people were more worried about being disloyal and losing their pensions. I think the implications for the teaching of entrepreneurship are that we darn well better stay current, and we better be talking in our cases not about yesterday but about tomorrow, and we're making a conscious effort to do that.
I'm wondering, we've talked a lot about entrepreneurship. We haven't defined whether or not we're speaking mostly about true startups or companies as they grow and want to retain their entrepreneurial spirit. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about what does it really take when you get to a scale point, and I'm not talking about 10, 20, 30 people, I'm talking about 1,000, 1,500 or more people, and you really want to retain that nimbleness.
You guys have done it.
No, I took my turn.
So I think it comes back to something that I said, at least the most successful entrepreneurial companies that I look like, and that's focus on really what problem are you solving. Is there a clear pain point that exists? Are we offering some type of value proposition that's compelling, and recognizing that that changes over time? I think the winners that we've seen kind of time and time again are willing to cannibalize what they're currently doing in order to take advantage of those markets. They're focused not as much on competition, but on solving those kind of growing problems. I think for a lot of companies, finding the opportunity to get into a fast-moving stream and have some wind at your back kind of helps, where the market pulls you along and creates some a real sense of urgency within the organization to keep it up. We have a term, at least within our organization, that we call this divine discontent, and that means we're never really satisfied. We'll celebrate success of a team member or success of the group, but then always kind of say, what else can we do, and not kind of rely on what's been accomplished in the past. I think we've found that to be effective both through, kind of those breakpoints of 50, 200, 500, 1,000 employees. And it's hiring people that have that same belief, that aren't looking for a job where it's going to be the same for the next 10 years. They're looking for impact and change.
John, I might just offer a thought that could possibly help some of you who are managing people. How many of you have direct reports that you supervise? So that's perhaps half or so. So just a thought for you to consider. As you manage those people, one of the things I've seen, again anecdotally, we haven't done research on this, but one of the flaws I've seen in effective management has been the unwillingness of somebody at level A to deal with a problem that exists at level C, where the person responsible for dealing with the problem at level B doesn't know how to solve the problem. So we have a problem here. It's this person's organizational responsibility, but the person at the top or at this level sees it. And there's the temptation for this person to go to this person and say, this problem exists. It's within your purview. I'm hoping that you can find a way to figure this out. We need to get this problem solved. And that's all in the interests of not disempowering that middle manager. We don't want to disempower him or her by saying what should be done. But suppose we're up here and we know what should be done. Let's just make it simple. And I realize rarely is the world simple, but oftentimes it's pretty clear what needs to be done. How about we sit down at this level, and this is you, and say to the person at this level, and this is your direct report, we have a problem here. I'd like to work with you to figure out how to solve that problem. I have some preliminary ideas. I'm not asking you what you think should be done because I'm assuming the best about you and you've been worrying about this problem and you haven't figured it out yet. So what you think should be done isn't working. So I'm not asking that question. I'm coming in and saying, I have some ideas about what should be done. I'd like to work with you to solve this problem. I'm not disempowering that intermediate manager. I'm actually empowering him or her by helping him or her to become more effective, become a better manager, and re-engage with the people having the problem and help to solve it. So I have really opened everything up and made it okay to stumble and okay to intervene. And there are no losers in that picture. But somehow some of us get the idea that we're stepping on toes if we do that. I'm just entering one vote for proactive management when you see a problem that's 2 levels below you. It will be effective. It will make your organization better.
Shifting gears a little bit, when we were all here, we were educated in subterranean dungeons without Wi-Fi and without these things. And I'm actually really curious about the quality of the education and the interaction with all of these distractions around and how you think that's impacted the leaders and entrepreneurs of the future that you're interacting with daily.
Yeah, I would say each faculty member has kind of taken their own approach to it. Those of you who've had me as an instructor, no, we don't allow it in the classroom. We think it's distracting. We think it's in large part a distraction from the learning and being present in the situation. It can be a distraction to our guest. Almost all of our cases in entrepreneurship have a protagonist, and I think they appreciate full presence in the discussion at the point in time. So it can be a useful tool outside of it. I think there's a lot more electronic communication. It's easier to update class changes to class content and so forth. So I think in that way it's a tool. But I think at least from my personal perspective, it hasn't been an addition to the in-classroom experience.
I think one, when I started teaching, which was 25 years ago, basically the model of teaching that was used everywhere in higher education, with a few exceptions, was the faculty member stood in front of the room of students sitting there and conveyed knowledge to them that they had no other way to get access to. The faculty member was the unique source of all that knowledge. And one thing about having the internet is that's just not true anymore. For almost anything that a faculty member would say, or many things a faculty member would say, you could just Google it. And that is actually, in a way, fundamentally, it's reshaping education, which takes much longer to actually change, because it's slow to change people's teaching styles and so forth. But the way that Irv was teaching long ago in entrepreneurship, which was more about discussions, more about focused on role plays, more about actively engaging students, which actually, from decades of research in education, we know that's a better way to learn. It's just, there's lots and lots of evidence showing that's just a better way to assimilate information is through active learning. That's the way that education is going to have to move, and is moving. If you look at how, right now, at the way we teach at the GSB, it's a minority, in fact, a relatively small minority of our classes that have that traditional model of education. And every year it goes more and more in the direction of having more education that looks like discussions, looks like role plays, it looks experiential, it looks people hands-on. And that change eventually, we're actually way ahead in doing that. That change eventually is going to spread all through higher education. It's going to take time because people were trained and educated in different ways of teaching. But that change will eventually get everywhere, because the old model, it probably wasn't as effective, and technology has made it less and less tenable. There'll always be space for someone who can get up in front of a classroom and just give an incredible lecture that inspires people and so forth. But that's not the future generally of education. Part of that is technology. It's like one more question to wrap it up.
I guess compared to the state of entrepreneurship, at least when we graduated, it seems that students now have more options. It seems entrepreneurship is more sexy, right? So how do you coach current students to think about, should they take the corporate route or should they start a company? Because to be honest with you, during the time when I graduated, going to a company is a viable option, but it seems every student that I talk to now wants to at least start a startup or join a startup. So how do you coach current students in this new world of entrepreneurship?
Well, I'm slightly repeating one thing I said earlier about counseling, but I think my first question to that student would be, where do you want to be in 10 or 15 years? What kind of job do you visualize as you close your eyes and put your head back would be appealing to you? Do you want partners? Do you want to be a sole operator? Do you want to be part of key management at the top? Do you visualize a larger entity? Is this a company on this side of the river, which is advisory and investing? Is it on this side of the river that's operating? What do you actually want to be doing in some years down the road? And I think that there are many roads to Rome, but that starts to help simplify the early step and rule out some of the alternatives, perhaps not all. I think that's just a really sound place to begin.
I think the next step is saying, where are you going to learn the most, right? There's a great faculty member who has a saying, don't spend 5 years getting 2 years of experience. Find yourself a place where you're going to learn, where you're going to be in a steep learning curve that's going to help take you towards that objective. I think the other piece of advice, which I think is sound, is it's not going to matter what you do immediately out of the business school. In a lot of ways, for your first job, I don't know what the statistics are now, but over half of my class had changed their job within the first year, 75% by the time you were back for your 5th-year reunion. So as long as you're learning and kind of on that path that's in the general direction of what you think your objectives are, maximize for learning.
All right, Irv and Jim, let me thank you for doing this.